Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, if you do enjoy the video that you came here to watch, do me a favor, go ahead and hit that little red subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. It really does help my audience grow. It really does help this channel grow. It means more than you realize. So go ahead, hit that little red button. Also, remember, full episodes of the Aaron Torres podcast, wherever you download your podcast, Apple, Spotify, etc. Now, here is the video that you came here for.
Why Tennessee fans aren't mad is because what's really interesting is something that came up, and I think this is the big talking point out of week 2. Tennessee loses at Georgia. Like I said, there's no shame in that. Georgia's a great program, maybe the best program we have in college football right now. But with that said, they fall, and they only fall to number 5 in the rankings. And by the way, I think that's totally fair. I think that's perfectly a reasonable spot for them. I think you could argue they should be at number 4. If TCU's resume wasn't better than Alabama's last week, it's not better than Tennessee's this week. But having them at number 5 is interesting for this reason. If you look at the top 4, the 4 teams ahead of them, Georgia, okay, whatever. Ohio State, then Michigan, then TCU. Why is that important for Tennessee at number 5? It's because 2 weekends from now, Ohio State plays, drum roll please, you guessed it, the Michigan Wolverines. And so I think Tennessee fans are waking up on Wednesday, Thursday morning, sitting there saying, listen, if we win out, one of the teams ahead of us is going to lose a game. All we got to do is win out from here, and we're going to the college football playoff. Now, what I would say, Tennessee fans, I'm not saying you're not going to the playoff if you win out. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I would say is be careful thinking that way. And more importantly, I want to get into what would be the scenarios that Tennessee potentially gets left out. Now, if you're a Tennessee fan, here's the good news. I do think you are going to have the trump card over the loser of Ohio State, Michigan. I don't see any scenario where a one-loss Michigan or Ohio State gets in over one-loss Tennessee, assuming, of course, that none of those teams lose outside of the Michigan-Ohio State game. In other words, if Michigan or Ohio State is not the Big Ten champ, I don't think that they're going to have a better resume than Tennessee, who obviously is not going to win the SEC with the way things are currently going. So if it's an 11-1 Ohio State or an 11-1 Michigan versus an 11-1 Tennessee, Tennessee's going to have the better resume. We just talked about it with Michigan. Michigan's schedule stinks. They played nobody in the out-of-conference except for the UConn Huskies, played nobody in the out-of-conference, okay? On top of that, the Big Ten is just down. So they have a decent win against Penn State at home. If they don't beat Ohio State, they have no resume to really speak of. And so why that's interesting to me, I don't think Tennessee would get jumped by Michigan if they lose to Ohio State. And I don't think Ohio State's going to have much of a leg to stand on if they lose to Michigan. They'll have a couple good fringe top 15-ish wins with Notre Dame, which is kind of moving up. Week 1, obviously, Ohio State played Notre Dame. Penn State, okay, we'll see where they end. But there's going to be nothing on that resume that's more impressive than what Tennessee did by going to LSU and getting a win, which is probably going to be your SEC West champ, and then beating Bama at home, even though I think Bama's a little bit overrated right now in the polls. Beyond that, I'd say this. I think the Tennessee-Clemson conversation becomes interesting. I think the edge would probably go to Tennessee. Again, it comes down to what is Clemson's resume going to look like at the end of the year? Now, right now, NC State is currently 7-2, and they're in the top 20. Are they going to finish that way? I don't know. Florida State, 23rd in the country right now at 6-3. So right now they have 2 top 25 wins. Neither of them is more impressive than Tennessee's 2 best wins. They will play potentially North Carolina in the conference championship game, which is at number 15. But again, is a couple fringe top 15 wins going to be better than what Tennessee has as an 11-1 non-SEC champion? I'm not sure. I think Tennessee would get in over a one-loss Clemson. I think the way the committee is saying it, they'll definitely get in over a one-loss TCU if they were to win the conference but lose a game. And then at that point, the conversation becomes completely different. And I think they get in over the loser of Michigan, Ohio State. Where I do think it gets complicated, though, is this. that pesky old Pac-12. And I know what you guys are sitting there saying, there is no way that anybody in the Pac-12 is better than Tennessee. And I'm not going to sit here and argue who would win in a neutral site game, Oregon versus Tennessee, or USC versus Tennessee, or UCLA versus Tennessee. What I do think, though, is that if any of those three, and right now I think it's important to note, Oregon is undefeated, or Oregon, is 8-1, UCLA and USC, all three are 8-1. I do think there'd be an interesting argument about all three if they were to win out and win the conference. Keep in mind, by the way, next week we'll get some clarification. Oregon will play Utah at home. Utah is a top 15 team as well. And USC and UCLA will play at the Rose Bowl next Saturday. So we'll get some clarification on this. But I think all three of those teams, if they were to win out, they would have a very compelling case that they should jump Tennessee over. They should get into the playoff over Tennessee as a one-loss Pac-12 champ. And let me explain why. Let's start with UCLA. Because I think people would sit there and say, well, UCLA didn't play anybody in the out of conference. There's no way they deserve to be in over Tennessee. And what I would say is right now, UCLA doesn't have a resume that's anywhere close to Tennessee's. But think about what UCLA could be by the end of the year. Right now, they do have one very impressive win. Utah at home. Utah's currently number 13, 7-2 overall. We'll see what happens next week with Utah. Then they play USC. USC could be a 10-2 team to finish the season if UCLA beats them. So if UCLA beats USC and Utah, those are two pretty good wins. And then, oh, by the way, if Oregon wins out, they're going to be a top 5 team going into conference championship week. Remember, Michigan or Ohio State is going to lose. Tennessee is going to go into the 4 spot. Oregon's going to be number 5. If you beat a top 5 Oregon team, all of a sudden by the end of the year, that UCLA resume looks pretty darn impressive. 3 wins against teams that are going to finish in the top 15. And here's the caveat. At that point, UCLA would have avenged the only loss of their season. They played Oregon at Oregon and got smoked, okay? I'm not trying to discredit Oregon for that. But what I am saying and why I think it's important is if UCLA were to beat Oregon in a rematch, you could sit there and say, hey, they went on the road. It wasn't their best day. They have now beaten everyone on their schedule. They're 12-1, 3 impressive wins. And more importantly, they beat the team that beat them. So that's the interesting one from UCLA. And I think it's a compelling conversation if UCLA were to win out. Let's look at USC because I think USC is really interesting. Now, USC, if you told me who is most likely to win out, believe it or not, I would say USC is probably in the 3rd position. And I'll be blunt. I would say the same thing about UCLA as well. I don't think USC is one of the top 4 teams in college football. But again, if USC wins out, they're going to have a very compelling resume. Right now, there really is no great win on USC's resume, which is why I don't understand why they're ranked ahead of UCLA. But if they were to win out, here's what their resume would be. First off, their only loss would be by 1 point on the road at Utah, which is going to finish in the top 15. Then they would have beaten UCLA on the road, which we're talking about a potential top 10 team. Obviously, they beat Oregon in a neutral site conference championship game at that point. That is probably a top 5 to top 10 win. But here's the catch. On top of playing UCLA this 2 weeks from now, and on top of playing Oregon potentially in the Pac-12 championship game, they also play Notre Dame. And all of a sudden, Notre Dame is ranked number 20 right now and just beat Clemson. So all of a sudden, by the time you play Notre Dame, they could be a top 15 win. Now, they would fall if they lose to USC. But if USC wins that game, you're talking about in the final month of the season, a win at UCLA, Notre Dame at home, Oregon on a neutral field. That's a pretty good last month. You're talking about 3 wins in the top 20, 2 in the top 15, 1 probably in the top 5 by the time you play Oregon. And on top of all of that, you have a situation where, you did what you were supposed to do late. You had success late. And 2 of those wins, the one win, the one loss would have been by 1 point against a good team. This isn't Clemson getting destroyed, okay? This is a loss to a good team by 1 point on the road when you have the ball a chance to win late. So that's the USC argument. Now, Oregon, that one's probably the most interesting. If Oregon were to win out, here's what they would do. Already beaten UCLA, beat them convincingly. Play Utah next week, another top 15 win if they were to get it. And then they would play USC or UCLA in the Pac-12 championship game, whoever wins that game. So you're now looking at either 2 wins over UCLA plus a win over Utah, or a win over the 3 other best teams in your league, asserting yourself as by far the best team. Then Oregon and Dan Lanning go to the podium the night of the Pac-12 championship game and say, we beat everybody in our conference. The only loss of the season was on opening day, the first game of the season 2.5 months ago, 3 months ago at that point, in Georgia against Georgia. And we went 13-0 since and we're conference champions. I guess it would be 12-0 since and we're conference champions. That's a pretty compelling argument. And can you imagine if on the final day, under this hypothetical, we got Georgia in the playoff, we got either Michigan or Ohio State, and we got TCU. Can you imagine that committee in that room sitting there saying, do we take Tennessee at 11-1, whose only loss was at Georgia, or Oregon, who's 12-1, Pac-12 champ, and whose only loss is to Georgia in a neutral field that was in Georgia? I'm not telling you what I know what the committee would do. It would set up for a fascinating conversation, and we'll see. Tennessee fans, take a deep breath. We'll see what happens. There's a lot of football to be played. But the Pac-12, to me, that's the one you got to worry about. Clemson's got a really bad loss on their resume in terms of how it looked optically. Michigan and Ohio State are going to knock each other off. We'll see what happens with TCU. Where it gets interesting is that Pac-12 champion, though. If Oregon, UCLA, or USC, if any of them finish at 12-1, they're going to have a very compelling argument.